Many thanks. My name is Venghaus. I'm a junior professor for decision analysis and socioeconomic assessment at RWTH Aachen University School of Business and Economics. First of all, I would like to thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to present our current research here. I will speak today about the resilience of the European Green Deal in turbulent times, and we will specifically look at the COVID-19 pandemic and also the war in Ukraine. So on December 11th in 2019, Ursula von der Leyen announced the European Green Deal, Europe's vision for climate neutrality by 2050. And she stated that the goal of the European Green Deal is to reconcile the economy with our planet, to reconcile the way we produce, the way we consume with our planet, and to make it work for our people. So it has a strong focus not only on ecological sustainability, but also on the opportunities that come with it, with innovation, social development, and making it just for the people. She called it a Europe's man on the moon moment. So it's a very ambitious roadmap with a lot of challenges, which will be carefully assessed. So along with the objective of climate neutrality of the European Green Deal, comes the Fishbowl 55 program. It consists of 13 interconnected legislative proposals to deliver the targets. Again, objective is to make it fair, cost efficient, and competitive. And as you can see on the right side, there's a very broad mix of sectors that are included. So the carbon border adjustment mechanisms to make sure that carbon isn't moved outside of the borders of the European Union, land use, forest strategies, so all kinds of different sectors. Also, the mobility sector plays a strong role, and there's a policy mix between pricing, taxes, standards, and different support measures. But what we want to look at today is actually the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic and the war in Ukraine. And here you see some developments. So everyone's aware with the COVID pandemic, over 5 million deaths, a huge economic crisis globally. And so the question has been raised, can the European Green Deal survive the coronavirus? And similarly, now we see these growing pressures. We see an immensely strongly increasing natural gas price, oil price, inflation, a huge topic. So again, also here, the question has been raised, what impact does the war in Ukraine have on the European Green Deal? And so we wanted to look at this by asking the research question, in how far do the current global developments, especially the COVID-19 pandemic and the war in Ukraine, threaten the success of the European Green Deal? And we're doing this by looking at two sub-questions, one being what have been the political responses to the challenges? And then a second step that's not going to be in the center of this presentation today, it's an ongoing work, but how are the impacts of both the crises and the political responses to them reflected in key economic developments that we're actually seeing? So we began looking at this topic actually by looking and deriving theoretically the difference between a crisis and a time of turbulence. Both have been used for these two developments. So we wanted to understand what the differences are. So crises are generally described by key characteristics of threat, urgency, and uncertainty. They require an urgent response in a very uncertain situation that threatens fundamental values of life support systems. So a crisis is generally a situation when the available time for a response is so short before a decision has to be made. It unexpectedly catches the members of the decision-making bodies off guard and under limited knowledge. Decisions have to be made. Turbulences in an economic sense are a bit different. So here again, we have an interplay of events or demands that are highly variable, volatile, and unexpected, and also unpredictable. So in this sense, they're very similar to crises. They can also reveal the fragility of institutions. They may contribute to unexpected dynamics that test the resilience of existing institutions and governance systems, but they're to a lesser degree immediately threatening. And so here, what we see is that actually different reactions are required and possible in either of these cases, which makes it very important to actually differentiate and and assess whether a situation must be considered a crisis or a turbulence. In a second step, we conducted a computer-assisted mixed method text mining approach using the software Max QDA. And as a case study, we looked at the German national parliamentary meetings. We used the past legislative period, which began in 2017 and runs until now, so about 3 to 4 weeks ago. We have a total database of 96 protocols of these parliamentary meetings. And for the analysis that we're going to discuss in this presentation today, we use the part of the coding scheme, which I'm also going to introduce, that focuses on mainly energy technologies and the target triangle of the energy transition, consisting of the 3 goals of environmental sustainability, security of supply, and affordability and competitiveness. I'm not going to go into much detail on all of this. This is the complete coding scheme. As you see on the top left, we have the parties that we looked at how the different parties acted, the motions, the proposals that are taken for action, renewable energies, fossil energies, and all kinds of sub-targets to the general overarching targets. And from here, I want to jump directly into the results. So in the first step, we looked at the occurrence of targets of the energy transition in the coded segments. And here you see the top line, the security of supply has essentially over the entire period been sort of the main topic that has been discussed in these parliamentary debates. But what we also see is that with the beginning of the pandemic in 2020, there have been some shifts in the debates that are actually notable. So environmental sustainability is still on a high level, but has decreased. Whereas with the health and economic crisis that came along with the COVID pandemic, the question and the topic of affordability has become much more, more centrally discussed. We also see that the question of economic efficiency and competitiveness is becoming or became over this period a little less frequent. But we're also seeing is that the topic of energy independence, and this is one that came with the war in Ukraine, and we're going to discuss this a little more in the next slides, has now entered the stage and is becoming much more increasingly discussed. So another thing that we looked at is the share of the different energy sources. On the top, you see the brown part is coal. So with the decision to phase out coal power that was taken in 2019 by 2038, naturally the topic of coal power is a little less frequently discussed. Wind power has been stable over the entire period. But what we're seeing on the one hand is that the topic of nuclear energy, also the nuclear phase out in Germany had been decided actually before the coal phase out. But nuclear energy has increasingly been discussed now as a bridging technology, a possible bridging technology. So although Germany still holds on to the nuclear phase out, it's re-entered the discussions. And what you also see towards the bottom, the darker green triangle, is that the question of liquid natural gas with the war in Ukraine and the insecurity in gas supply is now more frequently discussed. So this brings us to the next question that we found interesting. So what technologies are actually discussed, or what energy sources actually discussed as bridging technologies? And here we see that over the entire period, gas was considered the bridging technology. But now with the instability of gas supply from Russia, we see that there's this strong drop towards the end in 2022. And now instead, alternative technologies that weren't much discussed as bridging technologies before have entered the discourse. So it's liquid natural gas, as I just mentioned, nuclear energy has re-entered the stage, and hydrogen is also more frequently discussed as a possible bridging technology. In the second step, we also looked at the motion, so the proposals for action in the parliamentary debates. You see that mainly in the middle part of the legislative period is when most of the proposals are made, the motions. Here we also see a pandemic effect, which is in the bold red bar at the bottom. You see that usually the second quarter of the year is the one that has a very high number of motions in the meetings. this had dropped significantly in 2020, which was actually the main start of the pandemic in Europe. But as you see in the following quarters, it has bounced back pretty quickly after this initial drop. We also looked similar like we did before at the share of the topics in these motions. And here we see a similar trend that is reflected in the actual debate. So we see that with the COVID pandemic, the topic of climate protection has actually significantly dropped. It has become less pressing or less present in the motions. And instead, with the health crisis, with the economic crisis, the question of affordability has moved to the fore. And then you also see on the right side the line that shows the security of supply. With the increasing instability of gas supply from Russia, we see that there are a lot of motions now that address the question of security of supply. We then decided to go into a more in-depth analysis of the three main targets of the energy target triangle. So on the top left, you see the topic of security of supply. Here we wanted to see what exactly are the topics that are discussed, and not unexpectedly, given the current war, we see that the energy dependence on other countries is the topic that has really grown in this year. Then we looked at the subtopics under the environmental sustainability topic. Here we see that the climate protection targets itself have dropped, and that instead now topics of environmental sustainability that address questions of human health, for example, have increased significantly. And on the top and at the bottom, you see the subtopic of affordability and competitiveness. And here you see that, as I mentioned before, the topic of affordability is really the main topic that's currently discussed. And that's a combined effect of both the pandemic with the economic crisis and its effect. But it also especially addresses the question of affordability of renewable energies. We have some parties now in Germany that previously were rather critical towards renewable energies, that now with the crisis, the gas crisis that we currently have, are discussing the topic of renewable energies as sort of freedom energies, and we need to make them affordable. Whereas we see now currently that the CO2 price and emission trading are topics that are not so frequently in the motions in these current times. But what we see here is that, so although the individual topics that are being discussed have shifted, other topics that are also a strong part of the European Green Deal have actually come to the fore. And this brings me to the conclusion. So in the first, as I mentioned, we first looked at whether the COVID pandemic is a crisis or a turbulence. And although we have to say that obviously economically and with respect to public health, it's certainly a crisis, with respect to the European Green Deal, it should be classified as a turbulence. So although in the upcoming of the pandemic, for example, the necessary measures related to the European Green Deal have been put on hold, neither the European Commission nor national decision makers at the time had to initiate immediate ad hoc responses against unknown risks during this period related to the European Green Deal. We also see that both the COVID-19 pandemic as well as the war in Ukraine have led to significant shifts in the specific topics that are discussed. So affordability and security of supply have become more important. Climate protection is less frequently discussed. Our analyses have also shown that there are 6 attributes that are central for successfully navigating through times of turbulence. These are unity, adaptability, attention, persuasion, benefit, and reflection. And here we find that especially the lack of unity is one that within the EU and between the EU and its member states has posed a major threat to the European Green Deal. So re-strengthening cooperation will be central. But we also see with the response to the war on Ukraine, now there's a lot of cooperation and re-strengthening unity within the European Union. So this can also be seen as an opportunity regarding achieving the European Green Deal. And what we've also seen is that rarely ever can decision makers at the same time and concurrently and effectively focus on two crises at the same time. So usually what we see is that the more immediate threat is put on the center stage. And this we also see in this case. So once Russia began the war in Ukraine, we saw that this has become the main topic, whereas the topic of the COVID-19 pandemic is much less frequently discussed now. And as I mentioned before, the next step of our research will actually then look into the actual developments and whether we see measurable changes and correlations in selected European Green Deal related indicators using statistical econometric analyses, and whether we can see effects of the political responses and decisions taken during this time on these developments. And with this, I would like to come to the end. Please do get in touch if you find this research interesting and would like to discuss further. And I now look forward to the questions. Many thanks.